They say the Caldwell fire died in 1847, but that's a lie. The truth is, it never went out. It still burns, in letters hidden inside family Bibles, in courthouse ashes, and in the bloodlines of two women who defied a world built on ownership, purity, and silence. Two sisters, one secret, and a decision so unthinkable that even time tried to erase it. Welcome to Wilkes County, Georgia. The year was 1849, a world gilded in white columns and rotting beneath them. Cotton wealth dripped like honey, sweet to the touch, poisonous underneath. Families like the Caldwells ruled the land, men of power, women of porcelain, and a field of souls they claimed as property. Elizabeth and Catherine Caldwell were the jewels of that empire, twin daughters of Thomas Caldwell, raised in a mansion where the piano never stopped playing, and the cries from the quarters were, "Just the wind." They were perfect mirrors, same faces, same smiles, same carefully trained gestures of southern grace. But behind the lace, something broke. And when it broke, it tore through history itself. Because what they did was not rebellion, it was heresy. Catherine Caldwell once wrote in her hidden diary, "I was raised to believe a man's color determined his soul, but when I looked into Samuel's eyes, I saw my reflection, and I could no longer tell whose soul was whose." Samuel was never supposed to be seen. A stable hand, bought and sold, catalogued as property in the ledgers of the plantation. But he could read, he could think, and in a world that punished thought, that was his most dangerous weapon. Elizabeth's forbidden heart found its twin in Elijah, a quiet man who tended the gardens. Two sisters, two men society called subhuman. Four hearts that met where the rules ended and truth began. It started with a book, a torn page from Milton's Paradise Lost that Samuel found in the trash. Catherine asked why he kept it. He said, "Because even angels can fall and still seek light." That line became their secret gospel. By the winter of 1849, the Caldwell plantation became a theater of ghosts. Every night the twins walked beneath the oaks, white gowns glowing like specters in the moonlight, toward the slave quarters where love was punishable by death. Every step was a crime, every whisper treason. But they believed love could rewrite the law of God and man. Catherine called it the Pact of Four. It wasn't just love. It was rebellion disguised as romance, a declaration that the walls between master and slave were illusions built by fear. They sealed their vow with blood, cutting their palms and pressing them together beneath the moon. Catherine wrote, "We were one flesh then, bound not by law, but by choice. The same choice Eve made when she bit the fruit and saw the world for what it was." The next morning, Elizabeth fainted at breakfast. Thomas Caldwell thought it was nerves. He couldn't see what his daughters had already become, traitors to his legacy, architects of their own exile. The fire came months later, March 17th, 1849, midnight. The sound of hooves, a scream, and then flames licking the walls of the storage barn. While the estate burned, 4 silhouettes vanished into the trees. 2 women in white, 2 men in chains they had broken themselves. The official record said abduction. The truth was escape. They didn't just flee the plantation, they fled the entire order of the South, the machinery of ownership, bloodlines, and purity. They wrote their own gospel with every step north, and years later, when one of the sisters returned under a different name, she discovered something chilling. The world they had escaped hadn't ended. It had adapted. It had found new ways to enslave without chains. That is the real curse of the Caldwells. Not the scandal, not the fire, but the pattern. How control survives through silence, how truth is buried until someone digs it up again. So tonight, you and I are digging. You're going to hear the story that was meant to stay hidden forever. Letters sealed in family vaults, diaries that spoke in code, bloodlines rewritten by shame. But as we descend together, remember this. Knowledge has a price. And once you know what the Caldwell twins did, what they uncovered, you'll never see history the same way again. Because this isn't just a story about forbidden love. It's about the machinery that built your world. It's about how power hides its crimes in the language of virtue. You're about to learn what the historians refused to print, what the church refused to bless, and what the blood itself refused to forget. Before we continue, write this in the comments right now. The fire still burns. Write it twice. That phrase will mean something later, when the truth reveals why the fire was never just fire. The deeper you look into the Caldwell story, the less it feels like history, and the more it feels like ritual. Because what Catherine and Elizabeth did wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a ceremony of rebellion against the system that created them. A ceremony that would haunt generations. By 1849, the plantation had become a house of ghosts. Its grand halls echoed with the rhythm of two lives trying to exist under the same roof but in different worlds. The world of the master and the world of the enslaved. Yet in the dark corners, the invisible walls between them began to dissolve. It began with Samuel and Elijah teaching the South, twins, how to see through the lie of the South. Late at night, they would meet in the abandoned carriage house, the air thick with candle smoke and forbidden words. There, Samuel read from books long outlawed among the enslaved, Milton, Blake, even fragments of the philosophers whose ideas threatened the very foundations of ownership and faith. Catherine listened in silence at first, then began to ask questions, dangerous ones. Questions like, if God made all men in his image, then who made the laws that chained some and freed others? The room would go quiet after questions like that, because they all knew the answer, even if they dared not speak it. Men made those laws, not God. Their meetings turned from lessons into something darker, acts of transformation. Samuel would draw symbols in the dirt, a cross over a circle, a mark that meant equality in old African scripts. He told her that in his mother's village, such marks were used to bind oaths stronger than blood. Catherine traced the same symbol over her palm, her breath trembling, and said, "Then let it be our mark." Elijah and Elizabeth did the same, 4 palms cut with the same blade, 4 drops of blood mixing in the flickering candlelight. And that was how the Pact of 4 was born. They promised to live or die as one, to love without permission, to destroy the chains that had defined their lives. From that night, their bond became something unholy in the eyes of the South, because the plantation wasn't just a place, it was a machine. Every heartbeat, every coin. The housekeeper, Margaret, noticed the candlelight behind the stables at impossible hours. The overseer, James Whitaker, began asking questions he should not have asked. And Thomas Caldwell, father, master, and god of his small empire, felt the control slipping through his fingers. In Catherine's diary, one line repeats again and again through February 1849. The eyes are everywhere. She wasn't exaggerating. Letters began to vanish from her writing desk, replaced by new ones written in her father's careful script, warning her that her behavior was being noticed, that appearances must be maintained. He had begun hiring neighbors to watch his own children. Even the enslaved were ordered to report strange movements or whispers near the quarters. But by then, the twins were too far gone to stop. Their love had become a kind of fever, something that didn't feel like choice anymore, but destiny. Elizabeth's letters from that month are drenched in emotion. "The world has already damned us," she wrote to her sister. "Let us at least choose the manner of our damnation." Those words would become their prophecy. The final week before the escape was marked by omens. A mirror shattered in the dining room without reason. A black horse broke its leg and screamed through the night until it was shot. Catherine wrote that she began to dream of fire, of the plantation burning while faceless figures danced in the smoke. When she told Samuel, he said it wasn't a dream. It was memory waiting to happen. And then the night came. the night they crossed the threshold from inheritance to history. The twins dressed not in mourning black, but in the white gowns they had worn at their mother's funeral, the same mother who had died, giving them life. Around their necks they wore no jewelry, only red ribbons soaked in the blood from their palms. Samuel and Elijah waited in the shadows, carrying stolen maps, 2 lanterns, and enough hope to outlast the fear. They met beneath the oak that stood at the edge of the quarters, a tree that had once been used for hangings. The irony was not lost on them. Catherine wrote the final words of her diary by that light. We stand where others have died, and still we walk forward. Minutes later, the distraction began. The storage barn went up in flames. A fire started with kerosene and a prayer. The smoke rose like a signal to the heavens. While the estate panicked, the 4 slipped into the woods. Behind them, everything they had ever known collapsed in heat and ash. When dawn came, Thomas Caldwell looked out over the smouldering remains of his empire and believed his daughters had been stolen by savages. In truth, they had freed themselves. But he couldn't see it. He wouldn't, because to see that meant acknowledging that his bloodline had chosen love over supremacy, and that was a thought more terrifying to him than death. Weeks later, their absence became legend. The South whispered about the ghost brides of Georgia, 2 women who had lain with the enslaved and vanished into the night. Some said they were hunted down and killed. Others claimed their spirits cursed the land, appearing in the fog near the old oak where their oath had been made. But the truth was buried deeper, under layers of denial and pride. Thomas Caldwell's letters grew darker, written in a hand that shook with rage and shame. I raised angels, he wrote to his brother, and they have chosen to live among beasts. It was the last line he ever wrote before collapsing at his desk, and yet, even after his death, the curse of the Caldwell twins lingered. People said they could hear laughter near the burned barn, or see lights flickering in the fields long after midnight. Some claimed that the fire still burned underground, impossible to extinguish, feeding off roots and memory. But what they didn't know was that the fire wasn't beneath the ground. It was inside the bloodline. It was inside the history of a family, a town, a country that would spend the next century pretending it never happened. Because the Caldwell sisters didn't die that night. They became ghosts of another kind, living ones. Walking reminders that love can defy law, that truth can burn through lies, and that the fire, no matter how deep it's buried, still burns. And as we continue this story, remember, the deeper we go, the closer we get to the truth the South tried to erase. The truth that power fears more than anything else, the moment when ownership meets love and loses. Morning came heavy over the Caldwell plantation, the air thick with the smell of ash and betrayal. The fire had been small, but its meaning was immense. It marked the end of one world and the violent birth of another. The overseer, James Whitaker, stood at the edge of the charred barn with soot on his hands and fury in his eyes. He knew something had gone wrong, something far worse than a simple act of arson. The twins were gone, and with them, 2 enslaved men whose names he spat out like curses, Samuel and Elijah. Within hours, the story was set. Whitaker spread it like a sermon. The girls had been taken, dragged into the night by savages from their own quarters. He said it loud enough for every terrified servant to hear, and the echo of it spread beyond the plantation walls. It was easier to believe they had been stolen than to accept they had chosen to leave. Because choice was dangerous. Choice meant ownership of the soul, and the system that built the South depended on one truth above all, that certain people had no choice at all. Thomas Caldwell refused to eat, refused to sleep. He walked the verandas with a pistol on his hip and madness in his eyes, ordering search parties, interrogating anyone who looked away too long. The reward notices were printed by the hundreds. 2 runaway slaves, male, 1 tall, 1 shorter, skilled in carpentry and horsemanship, accompanied by 2 white women, possibly abducted. But the lie was obvious to those who knew the twins' hearts. Margaret, the housekeeper, found a scrap of paper in Elizabeth's writing desk, tucked between folded linen, a line written in haste, ink smudged by tears. "If you find this, know that we are free. We took nothing that was not already ours, our own souls." Margaret burned the note before anyone else could see it. She told herself it was mercy, the kind of mercy only silence can give. Because she understood what would happen if the truth got out. The men would be hunted and hanged, the girls dragged back in chains not of iron, but of shame. Days turned into weeks. By April, the search had crossed into neighboring counties. Rumors multiplied, sightings in Savannah, in Augusta, even as far as Charleston. None confirmed, all whispered. It was during this chaos that a single letter arrived at the Caldwell estate, addressed in a hand no one recognized. The courier said it came from a traveler on the Savannah Road who refused to give his name. The seal was a simple wax circle, no crest, no initials. Thomas read it in his study and collapsed before he reached the end. The doctor called it apoplexy, a stroke brought on by shock. But those who were there swore his last words were not of pain, but of disbelief. He whispered, "They wed them both." When his brother Edward arrived from Charleston to settle the estate, he found the plantation like a carcass, half the workers gone, the land scorched, the house silent. In Thomas's desk, he found a small box carved from cherry wood, sealed tight. Inside were 2 hand-drawn certificates, written in uneven ink. Elizabeth Caldwell wed Elijah Davis. Catherine Caldwell wed Samuel Johnson. Both dated March 17, 1849, the night of the fire, and beneath them a letter in Catherine's delicate script, written not with fear but conviction. "We did not sin, Uncle. We simply refused to believe that love requires permission. We chose to live as we were made, not as we were told. Forgive us if you can, but do not call us victims. We were awake." Edward locked the box again and buried it in the family vault. He told no one what he had found. To the county, he declared that the twins had been abducted, most likely murdered. He published this version in every paper from Atlanta to Charleston. The story became official. It was easier that way, easier to protect the name than to protect the truth. But the buried things did not stay buried. In 1868, long after the war had ended and the South had begun to rot in its own memory, a journalist from the North arrived to collect stories of the old plantations. His name was William Hartwell. He found Margaret, the housekeeper, living in Savannah, old but still sharp. She told him everything she remembered, about the fire, the missing girls, the letter, the way the master's heart broke when he learned they had chosen to go. Hartwell's article was never published in his lifetime. The paper that commissioned him refused to print romantic fantasies of slave love. But his notes survived, hidden among his belongings, rediscovered by his descendants nearly a century later. That's how we know what the Caldwells tried to bury. That's how we know that history is not written by the victors. It's written by the liars who survive them. Edward Caldwell died in 1871, and with him, the last keeper of the secret. The plantation was sold, divided, and left to ruin. But even then, there were whispers of a woman who had come back pale and veiled, asking for something left behind. Some said she was a ghost, some said she was a daughter. The truth was stranger still. Because in 1865, 2 years before Edward's death, a woman calling herself Margaret Johnson arrived at the old estate. She spoke in a low voice, southern but faintly northern in accent. She carried no servants, no jewelry, only a single folded letter and a child's locket. The staff who answered the door swore she looked like a ghost of Catherine Caldwell herself, older, heavier, but unmistakable. Edward met her privately, and for hours the house was filled with voices. First calm, then angry, then silent. When she left, she carried nothing but that same letter and a look of finality. Edward never spoke of it again. But his journal, found after his death, contains one line written that same evening. The dead return not to haunt, but to demand to be remembered. The buried story of the Georgia twins was not a tale of tragedy. It was a rebellion carved into bloodlines. A truth the South could never confess, because to admit that two white daughters of a plantation master chose love with the enslaved was to admit that the entire structure of purity, ownership, and superiority was a fraud. So they turned them into ghosts. They erased them from the family tree, burned letters, fabricated deaths, and preached that nothing had happened. And yet the world kept turning, and the blood of the Forbidden Union kept flowing quietly through time. Every lie has an expiration date. Every buried secret begins to move when the earth shifts just right. And by the time the diary of Catherine Caldwell was unearthed in 1964, the world had changed enough to finally hear her voice. But that diary did more than confirm the scandal. It revealed that what they had done in 1849 was not merely rebellion or romance. It was part of something older, stranger, and far more deliberate. In the next section, we go deeper, into the diary itself, into the cryptic symbols Catherine drew in the margins, and into what modern historians now believe she and Samuel uncovered. A pattern of ancient rites, hidden inside the plantation system itself, the kind of knowledge that turns forbidden love into prophecy. When the Caldwell plantation was demolished in 1964, the workers found a hollow panel behind what used to be Catherine's bedroom wall. Inside it was a small leather-bound book, edges blackened with age, ink faded to the color of dried blood. It was her diary, and for the first time in more than a century, Catherine Caldwell spoke again. At first glance, the diary was what one might expect: careful cursive entries of daily plantation life, the weather, the garden, her father's moods. But as historians began to translate the text, they discovered a pattern. Random words capitalized where they shouldn't be. Latin phrases breaking through English sentences. Drawings of circles, trees, eyes, stars, hands. It wasn't just a diary. It was a cipher. And Catherine, it turned out, had been recording something far more dangerous than emotion. She had been documenting initiation. Early pages spoke of lessons under the oak, describing Samuel reading from a book she called The Silent Kingdom. This was no scripture, but a collection of teachings whispered among the enslaved, beliefs brought from West Africa and merged with the hidden mysticism of the Christian South. Samuel taught her that power was not given by birth, but by knowledge, that every man and woman carried within them a divine spark, stolen long ago by those who built empires on ignorance. He told her that true freedom was not merely escape, but awakening. Catherine listened, then began to write. But she could not record such teachings openly, so she invented her code. The names of people became symbols. Her father was the lion, her sister the mirror, Samuel the flame. And throughout her pages, the same recurring phrase appeared: "We must cross the river." For decades, historians assumed it meant escape. But modern scholars realize something else. It referred to an initiation ritual drawn from both African and Christian mystic traditions. Crossing the river was the passage between one life and another, between bondage and freedom, between illusion and truth. One entry dated February 28, 1849 reads, "He showed me the map within my own hands, 5 lines, 5 destinies. When joined, they form the path out of the cage." Underneath the line was a crude drawing of 2 hands joined, forming what looks eerily like the sigil of Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. The deeper you read, the clearer it becomes that Catherine's diary wasn't simply a love journal, it was a record of a spiritual conspiracy. She and Samuel believed that the plantation system wasn't only political or economic, it was metaphysical, a structure built to harvest human will. The enslaved weren't just workers. They were fuel. Their obedience, their silence, their broken spirits were energy sustaining the illusion of order. And in this cosmology, love, true, forbidden love, was the ultimate rebellion because it broke the invisible contract. When you loved someone, the law told you to hate. The system lost control of you. The diary becomes more fevered as March approaches. She writes of strange dreams. To the outside reader, it might sound like madness, but hidden between these fragments is an ancient idea that through union, through joining what society had divided, balance could be restored. Black and white, male and female, slave and master, spirit and flesh. Their love was not only human, it was symbolic, ritualistic, transformative. It was heresy cloaked as affection. In one chilling entry written the night before the fire, Catherine confesses, "The lion dreams he commands heaven, yet he cannot see that his daughters have already stolen its keys. We will burn the false house to free the living soul within it." Here, the false house may have meant the plantation itself, or perhaps the entire illusion of southern purity. To her, the fire wasn't destruction, it was purification, the act of burning away generations of lies. After 1849, the diary stops abruptly. But on the final page, there is a passage written upside down, invisible until held against light. It reads, "The river is crossed. We live under new names. Let no one forget the fire was not death. It was awakening." That single line changed everything, because when archivists compared it with the letters later found in Boston and Philadelphia, they realized Catherine had continued writing, but under aliases. Fragments of her handwriting appear in abolitionist pamphlets, in anonymous essays defending interracial marriage, and even in early feminist journals. The voice of the plantation girl who defied the empire of slavery had become a hidden architect of a new world, and yet, in every letter, every trace, the same symbol appears somewhere near her signature, the Ouroboros, drawn like a reminder, the serpent consuming itself, the endless cycle, the warning that nothing truly dies, it merely transforms. For modern readers, the diary is both haunting and prophetic. It reveals that Catherine and Elizabeth's rebellion wasn't spontaneous passion, it was a culmination of generations of silent resistance, knowledge passed through whispered stories, concealed rituals, and coded prayers. Samuel and Elijah were not merely lovers, they were inheritors of an ancient faith of liberation. They saw the plantation for what it truly was, a temple of control disguised as a home, and they decided to burn it down. By the time historians translated the last page, one question lingered: how much of what Catherine wrote was metaphor, and how much was real? Did the symbols represent spiritual awakening, or something else entirely, something occult? In her code, the phrase, "the flame must pass to the next vessel," appears again and again, almost obsessively. Some believe she meant her children. That the blood of the Forbidden Pact carried not only love, but the fire she and Samuel had awakened together, the kind of fire that never goes out. That belief gained weight when genealogists traced descendants of the Davis and Johnson families, children of Elijah, Samuel, Elizabeth and Catherine, and discovered they carried almost identical ancestral marks, small circular birthmarks on their palms, coincidence perhaps, or the signature of a vow that outlived its makers. The diary ends with one final statement, a single line written larger than all others, scrawled across the inside cover. "If history buries us, then let the fire teach it how to remember." In that sentence lies the entire essence of the Caldwell secret, the understanding that the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a pulse. You can silence the voice, but not the vibration. You can burn the house, but not the fire. The diary closed one story, but opened another, one that linked forbidden love, rebellion, and mysticism into a Philadelphia, 1850. The city was a labyrinth of soot and prayer, its streets trembling with the pulse of revolution and decay. Somewhere amid the maze of alleyways and candlelit churches, 4 people who should have been dead began their second lives. They had crossed the river, as Catherine's diary foretold, and now they walked under borrowed names: Samuel and Catherine Johnson, Elijah and Elizabeth Davis. 2 couples bound by blood, shadow, and the memory of fire. They lived in a neighborhood known as 7th Ward, a quarter of narrow row houses, abolitionist safe houses, and whispers. It was a place where the freed and the hunted shared bread, where sermons doubled as secret meetings, and where every knock at the door could mean salvation or ruin. For a time they found peace there. Samuel found work at a livery stable, his knowledge of horses unmatched. Elijah built furniture for a church nearby, his hands carving wood with the same patience he once used to shape the gardens of Georgia. The sisters took in sewing work, their southern accents softened, their manners too refined for the world they now inhabited. To their neighbors, they were simply quiet families, respectable, hard-working, a little strange perhaps in their closeness, but never questioned. Yet every piece carries its own curse, because freedom for them was not a destination, it was a disguise. At night, Catherine still dreamed of the plantation, the oak, the fire, her father's eyes. She would wake trembling, whispering the same words she had written in her diary. "The house still burns." Samuel would hold her and remind her that the past could not follow them here. But both of them knew that was a lie. The past is the one thing that never needs a passport. Philadelphia was a city of watchful eyes. Slave catchers roamed its edges, emboldened by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made even the free states hunting grounds. Posters appeared on walls, promising rewards for escaped property. Catherine flinched each time she saw one. In her mind, she still heard the sound of her father's voice, the echo of the word property, and the way it had crushed everything she believed about love. When Elijah came home one evening with news of a man in the tavern asking too many questions about two colored men from Georgia with educated tongues, they knew the illusion of safety was fading. The hunters were closer than ever. Elizabeth, ever the calmer twin, proposed what seemed impossible, flight again, this time further north, to Boston, where Elijah had a contact in the abolitionist network. Catherine refused at first. She couldn't bear to move again, to uproot their fragile peace. But Samuel told her something she never forgot. Freedom that fears motion is still slavery. They left within a week, traveling under forged papers, moving by night through the Underground Railroad, their faces hidden, their hearts pounding. When they finally reached Boston, their names changed once more, not in ink, but in identity. They became shadows that walked among the living. Boston was colder, harsher, but freer in ways that felt almost unearthly. For the first time, they could walk in daylight without looking over their shoulders. They could speak in public, laugh in the open air, breathe without guilt. But even here, memory lingered. Catherine began writing again, not in her old diary, but in letters addressed to E., though Elizabeth lived only a few streets away. These letters became confessions, fragments of thought she couldn't say aloud. One of those letters survived, discovered in 1968 among the belongings of a Boston historian. It reads, "Sometimes I think we did not escape at all. We simply carried the South within us, its ghosts folded in our lungs, each breath a reminder, each heartbeat a rebellion. I hear Father's footsteps in every silence, and I wonder, was the fire his punishment or our forgiveness?" That line became a cornerstone for modern historians studying the psychology of escape, how even in freedom, the enslaved mind carries the architecture of captivity. Catherine was no longer a prisoner of her father's land, but of memory itself, yet she refused to surrender to it. She began teaching other women, both black and white, how to read, using her own diary as a hidden textbook. Beneath lessons of grammar and poetry, she embedded her code again, the belief that truth must hide within art until the world is ready to hear it. By 1855, both couples had built quiet but significant lives. Samuel's livery grew into a small business, Elijah's carpentry became sought after by abolitionist circles, and the sisters gave birth to children who would never know what it meant to live in chains. But fate has a cruel way of circling back to its beginning. In 1858, an article appeared in a southern newspaper reprinting a rumor that two missing Georgia women of fair complexion had been spotted in Boston, living in sin among the Negroes. Whether the story was true or bait, they never knew. But the fear it awakened was real. Catherine burned every copy of her diary she had, except the one she hid behind her wall, the one found a century later. Still, they refused to run again. Instead, they built something new, an invisible legacy. They joined abolitionist meetings under false names, sent money to escape networks, and most remarkably, helped found a small community school disguised as a sewing circle. There, freed children learned letters and numbers and whispered prayers that sounded more like mantras of rebellion. To the outside world, it was a chant, witty effort run by quiet women. In truth, it was a resurrection of the same secret Samuel had taught Catherine years before, the idea that knowledge was liberation disguised as learning. But peace never lasts long for those who carry forbidden fire. During the Civil War, Samuel and Elijah both volunteered for the Union cause under assumed names. Only one returned. Elijah's body was never found. Catherine wrote in one of her last letters, "The river takes one and spares another, but the current always flows toward freedom." She never wrote again after that. Elizabeth lived long enough to see the war end and the Emancipation Proclamation signed. She died in Boston in 1873, quietly, surrounded by her children. Catherine followed 4 years later. Both were buried under their chosen names, Johnson and Davis. No mention of the Caldwells, no hint of their origin. Just the same epitaph carved into both stones. The fire still burns. And maybe it does, because the blood they carried, their children, their children's children, spread across the country, blending into new generations who never knew where their strength came from. Some became teachers, writers, preachers, soldiers. Some never knew that their great-great-grandmothers once defied the entire machinery of slavery in the name of love. But somewhere, deep in their lineage, the same mark reappeared, a faint circle on the palm, the seal of the Pact of Four. The Northern Sanctuary gave them life, but it also turned their story into legend. A myth told in whispers, an untraceable thread in the fabric of America's hidden past. But if you listen carefully, to the old walls of Boston, to the wind through Georgia's oaks, you can still hear it. The sound of two women who burned their world to build a history hidden in faces, names, and symbols across time. By the time the century turned and the South had tried to wash itself clean with new flags and rewritten books, the world had all but forgotten the Caldwell name. The plantation was gone, reduced to ruins reclaimed by moss and memory. But the fire had not gone out. It had simply changed form, quietly burning through blood and lineage, waiting for a world ready to listen. The descendants of the Pact of Four, Samuel and Catherine Johnson, Elijah and Elizabeth Davis, spread like quiet threads through America's fabric. They did not bear the Caldwell name, but they carried its shadow in their veins. In the census of 1900, a Johnson family appears in Philadelphia, literate, employed, church-going. The head of the household, Robert Johnson, was described as a man of striking light complexion with eyes of grey. His sister, Anna Davis, a schoolteacher in Boston, wrote in her journal about the recurring dream of a burning house in a field of white flowers. She never knew why it haunted her. No one told her that it was memory, not dream, that the fire she saw was the same that her great-grandmothers had set to free themselves. Historians call this generational echo psychological inheritance. But those who understand the deeper languages of history call it something else, a memory in the blood. Catherine had written of it in her diary, cryptically. The river crosses us as much as we cross it. The water remembers the bodies that pass through. That idea, that trauma, love, and defiance can live on through flesh, has been proven in science only recently, yet the Caldwells knew it long before any lab could name it. The sins of the fathers and the rebellions of the daughters had merged into something undying, carried silently from one heartbeat to the next. By the 1920s, the families had splintered and blended. The Johnsons met, married into free northern blacks and Irish immigrants. The Davises moved westward, blending into the anonymity of American expansion. One branch settled in Chicago, another in New York. A few changed their names completely, some to pass as white in a world that still punished color, others to vanish into the new cities where history had no eyes. But every generation carried fragments, an old locket with intertwined initials EE, a wooden carving of a serpent eating its tail, a faded ribbon stained dark by something no one remembered. In 1937, during the WPA Oral History Project, an elderly woman named Martha Green, interviewed in Philadelphia, told a story about two white sisters who ran off with colored men and vanished into the wind. The interviewer dismissed it as folklore, but decades later, when genealogists traced Martha's lineage, they found she was a direct descendant of Samuel and Catherine Johnson. She had never seen a picture, never read a letter. The story had survived through whispers, sung in lullabies, coded in cautionary tales. Don't wander too far. Don't fall in love with those you're told not to. The memory had turned into myth, but the names remained buried inside the words. Then came the strange pattern that caught researchers' attention. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, medical records began to show an unusually high occurrence of a particular birthmark among Johnson and Davis descendants, a pale circular mark on the inside of the left palm. Doctors dismissed it as genetic coincidence, but in Catherine's hidden diary, now decoded, the same mark was described as the seal of the vow, a symbol of the flame that bound the Pact of Four. She had written, "Each generation that carries it will feel the memory awaken when the world needs truth again." When, for most of history, symbols are accidents until someone connects them. When the Georgia Historical Society rediscovered those connections in 1968, the idea of a living lineage from that forbidden union shocked the conservative South. Reporters called it the blood of the Caldwells. Some wanted to celebrate it as love's triumph. Others condemned it as blasphemy carried forward. But those who studied the old letters, the codes, and the timing of events noticed something stranger still. Every few generations, one descendant emerged, a writer, a preacher, a reformer, each obsessed, unknowingly, with the same themes. Truth hidden by power, equality born in secrecy, fire as rebirth. They were drawn to uncovering systems of control, to defying silence. It was as if the spirit of that long-ago rebellion resurfaced whenever the world began to forget what freedom truly meant. In 1965, the very year before Catherine's diary was discovered, a civil rights activist in Boston named Sarah Johnson published a pamphlet titled "The Fire That Teaches." In it, she wrote, "The blood that built this country has two colors, and until both are seen as one, we will keep repeating the same captivity under new names." Her words echoed almost exactly what Catherine had written more than a century earlier. No one noticed the connection at the time. Sarah Johnson never knew she was Catherine's descendant. The mark on her palm was simply a curiosity she had since childhood. Coincidence? Or continuity? History doesn't deal in coincidence. It deals in patterns, hidden like veins beneath skin. The same patterns Catherine wrote into her diary, the same shapes Elizabeth embroidered into her sewing lessons, the same designs Samuel carved into his wooden horses, circles, spirals, flames. They were trying to leave a map for those who would come later, a map of survival disguised as art, and perhaps their T-map is still unfolding. In 2003, a genealogical study tracing the descendants of mixed-race families from the 1800s found DNA markers linking several northern black families and white southern families to a single root in Wilkes County, Georgia. Among the names, two stood out: Davis and Johnson. It's not just ancestry, it's prophecy, because the bloodline didn't just survive, it adapted. Like the serpent consuming its own tail, the fire returned in every age under a new form. Abolitionists in one century, activists in the next, truth seekers now. Every generation born of the pact carries the same invisible inheritance, the refusal to accept the world as it is handed down. Somewhere out there today, men and women walk with that mark on their hands and have no idea that they come from the fire. They do not know that their courage to question, to love beyond boundary, to defy the acceptable, was written into their very blood. That is the legacy of the Georgia twins. They did not escape slavery merely to live free. They escaped to plant a rebellion that would echo through centuries. Their children became America's memory. Their blood became its conscience. and their story, buried and denied for generations, is the forbidden gospel that history could not kill. But history has one more twist, because long after the diaries, letters, and bloodlines were traced, one final mystery remained unsolved, a box discovered in 1978 in the ruins of the Caldwell estate, sealed beneath the foundation of the old study. Inside was a set of objects that made historians question whether Catherine and Samuel's rebellion had merely been human, or something far more deliberate, something designed to awaken in ages to come. In the next section, we open that box, and what was found inside changes everything you thought you knew about their story, and perhaps about history itself. In 1978, a team of restoration historians returned to the ruins of the Caldwell estate. They came searching for artifacts of plantation life, ledgers, iron tools, maybe fragments of china to fill the museum cases of Southern heritage. But what they found beneath the cracked marble floor of Thomas Caldwell's study was something that did not belong to any museum, something that breathed through time like a whisper from the grave. The box was small, cherrywood, reinforced with brass corners, sealed with wax that had turned black with age. No lock, just a carved symbol burned into the top, a serpent eating its own tail. The Ouroboros, the same mark found in Catherine's diary, the same one her descendants still bore faintly on their palms. When they opened it, the air inside smelled of smoke and rose oil. Inside were 6 objects, each wrapped in linen, each older than the Civil War, each pulsing with the intimacy of ritual rather than history. The first was a strip of red ribbon, faded, stiff and dark at the edges, the kind used by women to tie their hair or lace their gowns. But this one was different. Written along its length, in faint brown ink, were the words, "Bound by blood, free by fire." Later testing confirmed what the archivists already feared. The stain was not dye. It was human blood. The second item was a small silver mirror, its glass cracked in a perfect circle as though it had been struck once deliberately. Etched along its back were the initials EC and CC, entwined by an infinity symbol. When held under light, the cracks formed what appeared to be 2 faces, nearly identical, reflected infinitely, dissolving into one another. The third relic was the most confounding, a folded piece of parchment containing a map, not of land, but of symbols. Lines intersected circles, the same sigils found in Catherine's coded diary. 5 lines crossing at one point, labelled the river. Beneath it was a single sentence in Latin, Veritas ardet in aet, urnum. Truth burns forever. Scholars would later discover that the handwriting matched Samuel Johnson's, the enslaved man Catherine had married. The combination of classical Latin and African sigil forms was unheard of at the time, suggesting a fusion of 2 knowledge systems, the old European mysticism of forbidden books and the sacred geometries of West African spiritual science. The fourth artifact was a crude iron key, heavy, cold. No lock was ever found to fit it, but when researchers placed it under ultraviolet light decades later, faint letters appeared along its spine, Porta est in mente, the gate is in the mind. It was not a key to a door, it was a metaphor in metal. The fifth item was a locket containing miniature portraits, hand-painted faces of Samuel and Catherine, facing each other but never touching. Their eyes seemed alive under the cracked enamel, almost defiant. Inside the locket, under the portraits, a fragment of folded paper held 4 initials written in a trembling hand. S plus C, E plus E. The Pact of 4. But it was the 6th item that changed everything. A thin volume bound in black leather with no title. The pages were brittle, covered in alternating English, and a script historians at first could not identify. It resembled Akan Adinkra symbols, an ancient visual language of Ghana, blended with Latin incantations and Christian psalms. At the end of the final page, a message written in English, faded but legible. We left this, not to be found by the past, but by the future. The fire will find you when the world repeats its chains. The meaning of that line was debated for years. Some said it was prophecy, others madness. But then the historians realized something chilling. The date, written in faint graphite beneath the message, March 17th, 1849, the night of the fire. Experts spent years studying the book. It contained what appeared to be a fusion of spiritual and philosophical principles, half mysticism, half rebellion. One passage read, "Every empire of control begins by dividing the body of man against itself. One color, one class, one faith to stand above another. So long as the halves hate, the whole can never awaken. The work of freedom is not war, it is reunion." To the untrained eye, it was a love manifesto. But to those who understood the occult undercurrents of the 19th century, the Rosicrucians, the African mystic fraternities, the secret abolitionist lodges, it was something else. It was initiation doctrine. The Pact of Four was not only a rebellion of love, it was a ritual of union, designed to merge what power had divided for centuries. By the 1980s, whispers began circulating among historians that Catherine and Samuel had belonged to an underground network of spiritual abolitionists who believed that enslavement was not merely social but metaphysical, that the chains binding the body were reflections of chains binding the human soul. According to this belief, only through sacred union, black and white, male and female, enslaved and free, could humanity reawaken the original balance destroyed by empire. If that sounds impossible, remember this. Hidden fraternities and esoteric brotherhoods did exist across the 18th and 19th centuries. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Theosophists, all obsessed with alchemy and divine duality. The difference here was that the Pact of Four was not a European invention. It was a collision. Western mysticism meeting African cosmology inside the crucible of slavery. Love as alchemy, fire as purification, marriage as revolt. The sealed box, therefore, was not a family keepsake. It was an archive of initiation, a relic from a moment when four people tried to rewrite the metaphysics of ownership with our own blood. After the discovery, the box was placed under restricted access in the Georgia Historical Society vaults. Only fragments were ever shown publicly, and soon after the find, strange reports surfaced. Historians claiming the objects radiated static electricity, candles flickering during cataloguing, one archivist swearing the ribbon smelled briefly of smoke, even after decades sealed away. Rational explanations followed, chemical residue, faulty wiring, but the myth persisted. The fire, it seemed, still burned. Today the box sits in climate-controlled silence, its contents off-limits to all but a handful of researchers. Yet the echoes of what it holds continue to surface, in art, in books, in movements that defy division and hierarchy. Perhaps that was Catherine's plan all along, to plant something so dangerous that it could not be forgotten, only rediscovered. The sealed box wasn't merely history, it was a seed. And like every seed, it waited for the right season to rise again, because maybe, just maybe, the fire that began in 1849 was never meant to end. It was meant to pass through generations until the world itself was ready to burn away its lies. In the next section, we open the final chapter, the modern discovery that connects this legacy to the present, and how one family's forbidden love became the hidden foundation of a movement that still shapes the world today. By the time the sealed box was placed into climate-controlled storage in the 1980s, it was assumed to be little more than a curiosity, a relic of scandalous love turned myth. But history has a way of resurfacing when the world begins to mirror its own mistakes. And in the early 21st century, the world began to feel hauntingly familiar to Catherine Caldwell's coded warnings. Power tightening its grip, truth traded for comfort, division repackaged as identity. Once again, the halves were being turned against the whole. And that's when the fire stirred. It started quietly. In 2004, a young historian named Dr. Amelia Rhodes began a private re-examination of the Caldwell materials. She wasn't interested in scandal, she was interested in pattern. Her doctoral work was on symbolic resistance in 19th century African-American mysticism. When she gained access to the sealed box, she noticed something no one else had. The pattern of symbols drawn across the map on the third artifact matched the coordinates of 4 major American cities: Savannah, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. Each one marked by a symbol of the Ouroboros, as if they had been deliberately aligned along an invisible line across the East Coast. The line was not arbitrary. When plotted using modern geospatial tools, the 4 points formed a nearly perfect diagonal following a ley line used by early Native American trade routes, later co-opted by colonial expansion. Along this path, Dr. Rhodes discovered a network of churches, meeting halls, and cemeteries, each containing some variation of the same serpent symbol carved discreetly into stone lintels, pews, or gravestones, all built between 1849 and 1869. The conclusion was as terrifying as it was beautiful. The Pact of 4 hadn't died with Catherine and Samuel. It had spread, quietly, invisibly, like the roots of a buried tree. Rhodes traced the pattern through archives and found correspondence from early abolitionists who spoke in code about the Circle, a rumored society of men and women devoted not to politics but to spiritual emancipation. The idea that freeing the body was only half the work, that humanity's true slavery was ignorance. And the most startling evidence came from the diary's own prophecy. The fire will find you when the world repeats its chains. Rhodes presented her findings at a small conference in 2007. Most scholars dismissed them as romantic speculation. But 2 months later, something happened that made her theory impossible to ignore. A descendant of the Johnson line, a musician named Aaron Davis, reached out after reading her abstract online. He told her that since childhood, every member of his family had been told the same cryptic phrase by their elders: "When the world starts burning cold, the fire will return through you." He thought it was superstition. Until Rhodes showed him the diary. The encounter changed them both. Aaron bore the same faint circle mark on his left palm, the hereditary echo of the pact. He described having recurring dreams of water turning to fire, of a woman's voice whispering, "Truth burns forever." When Rhodes compared his descriptions to Catherine's writings, the match was uncanny. Details too precise to be coincidence: the oak tree, the red ribbon, even the phrase, "bound by blood, free by fire." The dreams were not inherited trauma. They were memory, awakening through time. News of the connection leaked, and soon others came forward, descendants from Philadelphia, Boston, even Charleston, each with similar marks, similar dreams. They began calling themselves the Fireline, a name born from both history and prophecy. Their gatherings were small at first, discussions on ancestry, history, and the mystic idea of balance that Catherine had written about. But what began as remembrance evolved into something far more potent, a philosophy of personal sovereignty, a modern reinterpretation of the Pact of 4. The Fireline movement spread quietly across universities and online forums, never claiming to be a religion or a cult. Because whenever truth begins to awaken, power moves quickly to smother it. In 2011, Dr. Rhodes's research grant was revoked without explanation. Her archives were sealed. The Georgia Historical Society quietly transferred the Caldwell materials to private ownership, citing security concerns. Then, 2 years later, Rhodes disappeared. Her apartment in Savannah was found intact, her computer wiped, her notes missing. The only thing left behind was a single line written on her kitchen wall in graphite: "The river crosses again." To this day, her disappearance remains unsolved. But her findings lived on through Aaron Davis, who continued her work independently, compiling oral histories from descendants across the country. He noticed a strange pattern emerging. Many of them had independently adopted the same motto without ever meeting each other: "Truth burns forever." The very phrase inscribed on the map inside the box. As word spread online, the Fireline's ideas began to appear in art, music, and literature. Independent filmmakers wove their symbols into visuals. Writers quoted Catherine's diary without attribution. Street murals across cities began depicting 2 women in white standing before a burning house, their hands joined, the serpent coiled between them. To most, it was anonymous art, but to those who knew, it was a calling card. The fire reborn. And perhaps, That is what Catherine had intended all along, to plant a story so potent that even if buried, even if forgotten, it would grow through cracks in the world's concrete until the truth could no longer be contained. The awakening wasn't a moment. It was a recurrence. The same fire that burned through cotton fields in 1849 now flickered in data, in networks, in consciousness itself. A modern rebellion not fought with torches, but with awareness. Because the systems had changed their names, but not their pose. The plantation had become the institution, the overseer had become the algorithm, the chains had become invisible, but the fire still recognized them. When you look at the world now, its divisions, its illusions of control, you can almost hear Catherine's voice beneath the noise, whispering through centuries. The house still burns. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the fire was never meant to end. Maybe it's not destruction at all, but memory reclaiming its rightful place. Because every time you question what you were told to accept, every time you love what the world tells you to hate, every time you choose truth over comfort, you become part of the fire line. So look at your hands. If you see even the faintest mark, real or imagined, know this. It doesn't mean bloodline. It means calling. The same one that began under an oak tree in Georgia when 4 hearts dared to beat as 2. In the final section, we complete the descent, unveiling the ultimate message of the Pact of 4, the meaning of the Ouroboros, and why their story was never about history, but about the cycle humanity is trapped in, and how only fire breaks it. Every fire, no matter how small, eventually reveals what it was meant to illuminate. The story of the Caldwell twins began as scandal, unfolded as rebellion, evolved into prophecy, and now returns as mirror. Because the truth isn't trapped in the past, it's repeating itself. History, like the serpent that devours its own tail, keeps turning in circles until someone learns how to break it. When you trace the symbols of the Pact of 4, the Ouroboros, the circle, the river, you find they all speak of the same thing, cycles of enslavement and awakening. Catherine and Samuel understood something that no historian or preacher of their time dared to say aloud, that freedom and bondage are not opposites. They are rhythms in the same system. Every society builds its freedom upon someone else's captivity. Every era creates its own plantation. New masters, new tools, new illusions of choice. The shape changes. The chain remains. That is what Catherine's final writings revealed. Hidden within the last page of her diary, encoded beneath the ink, researchers found a layer of words written with lemon juice, invisible until heat revealed them. The text was short, but it was her true last confession. We burned the house not to destroy, but to reveal. The fire is not punishment. It is memory made visible. And it will come again when the world forgets why we lit it. Those words weren't just prophecy. They were instruction. The Ouroboros was never meant to symbolize eternity. It was meant to warn against repetition. The serpent eats itself because it does not remember what it has already consumed. Humanity does the same, each generation feeding on its own ignorance, rebuilding the same hierarchies under new names, teaching new forms of obedience disguised as progress. Catherine's final message was not romantic, not mystical. It was psychological liberation, written in the only language her age could understand. Metaphor, secrecy, and love that defied law. And now, here we are, here again. The new century, the new empire, the new plantation. Not of cotton, but of data, attention, labor, image, identity. Where the overseers wear smiles, and the chains are invisible because they are chosen. Catherine would recognize this world. She would see that the systems have evolved, but the pattern remains. Divide and consume, obey and forget, fear and worship. She would know that the fire must return not to burn cities, but illusions. Because every empire ends not with revolution, but with realization. The descendants of the Pact, those who carry the faint mark on their palms, whether by blood or by choice, are not bound by ancestry. They are bound by awareness, To them, "The fire still burns" is not a slogan. It is a reminder that consciousness itself is rebellion. The same power that broke the chains of the flesh must now break the chains of the mind. The Ouroboros must be broken not by hatred, but by understanding the loop for what it is, a story the powerful tell to keep themselves alive. And maybe that is why this story survived in silence. Why the diary, the box, the mark, the dreams, all resurfaced now. The world is circling again toward the same precipice. Unity turned to hierarchy, truth turned to entertainment, history turned to myth. And once again, the fire waits in the hearts of those who can still feel it. The circle completes not with discovery, but with recognition. Every listener who has followed this descent knows it now. The forbidden love of two sisters and two men was never merely about defiance. It was a metaphor for integration. The merging of halves. The restoration of the whole. The final act of resistance is not destruction. It is wholeness. That's why Catherine's words matter now more than ever. Because when she wrote, "The gate is in the mind," she wasn't speaking of faith or magic. She was describing the final barrier between slavery and freedom, the belief that your world is unchangeable. That is the last lie the Empire tells you. Once that gate opens, once you realize the plantation is not a place but a pattern, you cannot unsee it, and that is what makes knowledge dangerous. The Pact of Four was humanity's first rehearsal for awakening. Its fire burned through generations, through silence, through denial, and has reached you. Not as history, but as inheritance. You are the proof that the fire worked. That memory endures. That truth burns forever. So here, at the end of the circle, ask yourself, which part of you still kneels to the old order? Which illusions have you mistaken for light? The moment you see them, the fire begins again. And that is the real legacy of the Caldwell twins, that the moment you remember, the world cannot go back to sleep. Because the house is still burning, the serpent is still eating, and the fire, it's not outside you, it's you. Pause. Deep, steady breath. If you've made it this far, you've crossed the river too. And now you understand what Catherine meant when she wrote her last words. We did not run from the world, we set it free. The circle is complete. The fire still burns, and now it burns through you.